Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are calling in from. Welcome to our panel today, hosted by the Waterloo Climate Institute. This panel is focused on COP28, Canada's position in the Global Stocktake. I'm thrilled to welcome our esteemed guests with me today to have this very important, complex, fascinating conversation about where Canada finds itself and where the global community finds itself when it comes to addressing the most important causes and consequences of climate change. So I look forward to a vibrant discussion today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I personally, although we are calling in from different places, I'm calling in from what is currently known as Waterloo, and this is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. This is what is called the Haldimand Tract, this part of land that I'm on. It's 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, which was granted to the Six Nations. And I mention this for a number of reasons, but chief among them, I think, for me at least, is to reflect on the generations upon generations of people, of the first people of Canada who have incredible wisdom and so much to share about how to cultivate a reciprocal relationship with nature that fosters, both a healthy and stable climate as well as deeply sustainable communities. So I think, listening to that wisdom is really a crucial part of our conversation around climate change, both in Canada and internationally. So I respectfully acknowledge my ability to work and live in this territory. So today we're going to start. I'm just going to give a little bit of context and background to our discussion around Canada's position in the Global Stocktake. You are very welcome to drop questions in the Q&A box, please, rather than the chat. And we will come to as many of those as we can at the end of our discussion. So I'll begin first with that background, and then I'm going to pose one kind of broad question, not a simple one, but a broad one, to our panelists, and each will have, each will have a few minutes to respond to that question. So here we find ourselves at a crucial moment, I would say, in the global effort to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are the cause of climate change, as we know, and also to address the ever accelerating impacts of climate change, which we know are unevenly distributed around the globe and within countries, unevenly distributed among groups within those countries. So both protecting communities from the extreme events and climate change impacts, floods, fires, et cetera, as well as rapidly decarbonizing are these, just two sides of the coin of this incredible challenge of dealing with climate change. And, I have sensed in the past in Canada that there was a feeling that because we are a cooler climate and a northern climate and a wealthy nation, that climate change was a sort of a distant problem for people elsewhere to happen in the future to people not here. And of course, that's patently false. And this last summer has made, I think, very evident just how tragic the consequences of climate change are even now. And this is even with a fairly modest amount of warming. So those impacts are very clear and the costs are astronomical. So we find ourselves in this moment where we're confronting the impacts of climate change and the challenge of rapid decarbonization. And one sort of scale at which the global community, one sort of avenue for having a global conversation on what to do, is through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the conferences of the parties that happen annually to advance our progress under the agreements that we've made globally to address climate change. This is a bit of an unusual year. We're coming up on the 28th Conference of the Parties to be held in Dubai. And this will be the site of important discussions around the first ever Global Stocktake. And what that means essentially is this is an important global opportunity to assess our progress towards the aims and objectives of the Paris Agreement of 2015. So how are we doing? This is such an important milestone and is stimulating a lot of conversation around the world. Ultimately with the objective, of course, of coordinating action. So each of our panelists will speak to this in some regard at various scales and in various sectors, but an early look at the findings from that global stocktake convey a message that is perhaps not a surprise. It was also one of the key messages of the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is that we are not on track to reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the pace and scale necessary to keep warming under that 2-degree threshold, or especially the 1.5-degree threshold of what we would call dangerous anthropogenic warming. Canada fares particularly poorly, it would seem. And a new report just released last week from Canada's Environment Commissioner says that we are also not on track to meeting our 2030 greenhouse gas reduction targets. And in fact, we're dead last among the G7. We are the only country among the G7 whose emissions have increased since 1990, declined over the last couple of years, but increased since the Kyoto Protocol baseline. So not good news for Canada and a challenging situation within which to work, but there's a lot behind that headline statement, and we're going to unpack some of that today. So, of course, some of the solutions that we're looking towards is, to scale up renewables, reduce our fossil fuel reliance, dramatically shift the underlying energy systems upon which we rely. And Canada is in not a unique position, but in a challenging position in that regard as a major producer of oil and gas. And that production of oil and gas contributes more than a quarter of our total national greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an elephant in the room when we have a conversation about what should happen here in Canada. So at COP28 coming up, United Nations member states will negotiate their response to the stocktake's findings. There are a number of possible outcomes that some of our panelists will help us understand. And we often hear Canada positioned as a relatively small contributor to global carbon emissions, GHG emissions. But we're going to tease that apart a little bit and challenge that notion and explore what leadership role Canada could and should take in light of this new evidence on our slow progress. So this is a bit of context, I guess, on where we stand at the highest level in Canada and what we're looking towards at COP28. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our panelists who will each have 4 or 5 minutes to reflect on a question. As bizarre as it may be, I'll briefly introduce myself, which I didn't do when we started, but I'm Sarah Birch. I'm the Executive Director of the Waterloo Climate Institute. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo, and I was also one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, contributing to the working group of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that focuses on greenhouse gas emissions, or what we would call mitigation. And my work at the University of Waterloo focuses on accelerating sustainability transitions and particularly the governance of those. That's all I want to say about myself. Okay, moving on to our next panelist, we have Professor Daniel Scott, who is a professor and university research chair in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. Welcome. Also at the University of Waterloo. For 20 years, his research has focused on the transition to a low-carbon tourism economy and adaptation to the complex impacts of a changing climate. He is co-leading the Global Tourism Sector Stocktake for COP28. In 2021, he was ranked in the world top 300 climate change scientists by Reuters. And in 2023, he was recognized as one of Canada's leading scholars when he was inducted as a fellow into the Royal Society of Canada. He's advised a wide range of governments and tourism organizations around the world, including the United Nations World Tourism Organization, United Nations Environment Program, World Bank, the European Tourism Commission, World Travel and Tourism Council, the International Olympic Committee, OECD, and many others. He's also been a contributor to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 3rd, 4th, 5th assessment reports, and their 1.5-degree special report. His tourism research publications have been featured in many leading media outlets. I see them all the time, including The Economist, the New York Times, Washington Post, and many others. So thank you for being with us today, Dan. Next up, we have Dave Sawyer. Dave is an environmental economist with more than 30 years of experience at home in Canada and abroad. He uses quantitative tools to underpin policy stories about transitioning economies to more sustainable futures. Collaboration is at the center of his approach, as is asking simple questions to unwind very complex issues. Dave strives to provide thought leadership with each engagement, which I'm sure he'll do here today with us. Dave's work can be found buried deep in regulatory processes or very public in policy documents of national interest. Dave has operated in bioeconomics for the last 30 years and is principal economist at the Canadian Climate Institute and a lecturer in environmental economics at the University of Ottawa. Thanks for being with us, Dave. Next up, we have Catherine Abreu. Hello. Cat is an internationally recognized, award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions to advance action on climate change. One of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy, as named by Apolitical in 2019, she has over 20 years of experience campaigning on environmental issues, including 10 years in the heart of the global climate movement. In 2021, Cat founded Destination Zero, a nonprofit that provides consulting services to other nonprofits working to build community for a fossil-free future. She joined the global climate think tank E3G as a senior associate in the same year. Catherine is one of 14 advisors appointed to Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body, the legally mandated arm's-length expert body tasked with providing advice to government on pathways to meet its climate change commitments. She also serves as an advisor to the Canadian Climate Institute and sits on the boards and steering committees of several organizations, including Climate Action Network Canada, the Global Gas and Oil Network, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and the Black Environmental Initiative. Her expertise makes her a vital figure, as I can attest, in climate policy and action, shaping global discussions on the transition toward clean energy. Thanks for being with us, Kat. I really appreciate it. All right, everyone. Okay, so now each of our panelists has 4 to 5 minutes to respond to a question that I have for them. Our order will be Kat first, please, then Dave, then Dan. So the question that we'd like to explore together today is, can you offer us a frank and honest assessment of our progress on climate change here in Canada? Can you set that stage for us? And can you help us understand what critical barriers and opportunities you see and why you feel it's important for Canada to take a leadership position? So with that multifaceted question in mind, I will pass it to Kat. Thank you.
Thanks. And yeah, I appreciate this very simple question that you've kicked us off with, Sarah. So yeah, great to be with you. I'm calling in today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe in what's also known as Ottawa, Canada, and preparing to head to the 28th Conference of Parties, the next round of UN climate talks in Dubai, UAE at the end of this month. I thought I might start answering this question, and I think I'll probably continue answering it over the course of our time together because there's a lot to say, by just reflecting on the last 8 years since the signing, or since the negotiation, I should say, of the Paris Agreement back at COP28 in 2015. And then that agreement came into force just 1 year later in 2016. It was the fastest international treaty to come into force of any international treaty, not just climate. That agreement was a real change in the way that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change worked. So previously, that system had called on parties to adopt targets that had been set for them in a kind of top-down way, according to their responsibility under the convention. And countries were broken up into a couple of different groupings, and what is known as Annex 1 countries were the countries that were expected to take on emissions reduction goals. And that is what the Kyoto Agreement, and those who might have heard of the agreement that preceded the Paris Agreement, was based on. So it was based on this top-down allocation by the UN system to rich countries, rich developed countries, of their emissions reduction goal. The Paris Agreement was born out of a kind of moment of crisis with that system, which really wasn't working. And it's too long to point out the various reasons that that system wasn't working, but it resulted in the Paris Agreement being a much more bottom-up process, where every country in the world was invited to come with their plan for what they were going to do in response to the climate crisis. And those plans became countries' commitments under the Paris Agreement, and they're referred to as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So this is what our Paris Promise is. And it's Canada's Paris Promise, our NDC, that is then baked into our climate law. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So that was a huge change in the whole system. Every country in the world is now expected to have a climate plan, is basically what the Paris Agreement said. And the other huge change the Paris Agreement made was inserting this commitment to hold warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which to avoid some of the most irreversible impacts of climate change. And that 1.5 degree goal is critical because, as Sarah was pointing out, we've now had on average about 1.1, 1.2 degrees of warming. This is the hottest year on record for millennia. So we're likely to hit it for average this year, close to 1.4 degrees of warming. It's a nightmare. Like, we can already see that this level of warming is unsafe and untenable. And so that shift in the Paris Agreement was significant. So this global stocktake was inserted into the Paris Agreement as a check-in moment for all of the signatories to that treaty to say, okay, how are we doing 5 years into the process after the Paris Agreement has come into force? We've got the Paris Agreement rule book landed in 2018. In 2023, how are we all doing? And what the Global Stocktake has been telling us is that when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, if we added up all of the countries' plans, it took us to about 4 to 5 degrees of warming. Now, 7 years after, 8 years after that treaty was negotiated, if you add up all of the countries' plans, we get to between 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming. So it's clear that the Paris Agreement has had some impact in making sure that there are climate plans around the world, and that those climate plans are working to reduce the projected emissions in those countries. But it's not good enough, because 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming is a total nightmare. In that same time period in Canada, we really went through a bit of a revolution in climate policy. Over 2015 to 2016, the Pan-Canadian Framework, the first comprehensive climate plan that all orders of government from provinces, territories, federal government were signed on to, was introduced. Since then, we've had a couple of more climate plans. We had the introduction of the Canada Net Zero Accountability Act, our first comprehensive climate law in Canada. So a real revolution in climate policy and climate governance. But as Sarah pointed out, the Auditor General is telling us that our emissions trajectory is still not on track. And I'll close my comments here with a little bit of a preview for what we will discuss later, which is that in both instances, in the global context as well as in the Canadian context, it's very clear that one of the major things holding us back from being on track to meeting our commitments is a lagging transition in the energy sector away from fossil fuel dependence and toward renewable energy. And that is the number one thing that it's clear that we have to nail this decade globally and here at home in Canada if we're going to be able to deliver on the promise of the Paris Agreement.
Thanks very much, Kat. That was excellent. I'll pass it to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. So I'll riff off of Kat a little bit and go back in time to around 2015, sort of the time bracketing the Paris era. Previous to that, Canada wasn't really doing a lot. There was a patchwork of effort going on at the provincial level. Canada's a federation. Some provinces chose to lead with policies. So you can think of Quebec implementing an economy-wide cap and trade system, British Columbia with an economy-wide carbon tax, Alberta with a large emitter carbon pricing program. And there really wasn't much going on, a few federal policies here and there, and they really weren't doing much. If you fast forward to today, we see upwards of 400 federal, provincial, and territorial policies and funding initiatives that are underway. We at 440 megatons at the Canadian Climate Institute, we've gone in and sort of identified these 400 policies and talked about sort of what they look like and what they're doing. And so when you look at how fast the country has moved in a very short time, you can be really optimistic to think we're starting to implement and sort of frame up the architecture needed to transition the economy and the emissions to 2030, our target, and NDC, as Kat mentioned, and then to get on a net zero pathway beyond that. The challenge, of course, has been one of implementation. So the federal government, although has moved ahead in a whole series of policies, there's a whole series of announced policies that are quite important. And in thinking about what has gone on, you can think about categorizing policies as legislative policies. So these are rules basically that exist, that are laws that exist in something called the Canada Gazette. And you can go in and see sort of vehicle efficiency standards and see that it's real. And you can look at the stringency of the policy and what it's trying to do. And basically it's delivering emission reductions. And then you can identify developing policies. So this would be something like a low carbon fuel standard or a ZEV mandate. We understand roughly what's going on there. There may be a draft regulation, so that's pushing towards implementation. And there's a whole series of other policies that sort of fit in this bucket. And then there are these announced policies like the oil and gas cap of the federal government, where there may only be a discussion paper and there's not much real understanding about what's going to happen and what kind of emissions reductions we get out of it. If you put those all together in a model, a long-term model that sort of accounts for economic growth, accounts for market transformation and technology, accounts for population growth, trade, we can see that the economy or the Canada is on track roughly with all these policies, roughly on track to hit the target in 2030, minus 40% below 2005 levels. But then it's a real question of implementation. What is being implemented? And when you start to look at these policies that are not being implemented, that are being talked about, that gets us down to this sort of 30% below level target that we're at, which is about 80, 85 megatons short for 2030. And then when you think about what else has to happen in terms of transformation to net zero, you see a real sort of need to increase ambition in the country pretty significantly. The backdrop there is rising emissions. So the building sector in Canada, emissions continue to rise. Buildings are hard to address, and oil and gas sector, and frankly, agriculture. So those three sectors alone account for most of the emissions growth we've seen in the country. So you have this sort of increase in economic activity that's going on that these policies have to fight against to drive emissions down. So although we have this broad range of policies, and I like to say we have the knobs and dials to tune emissions and the economy and tech deployment to this 2030 target, we really are fighting against a growing economy and frankly a growing oil and gas sector. So what needs to happen? Well, a couple of things. One, Kat alluded to better governance, so the Net Zero Accountability Act. We'll talk about this a bit later. The Net Zero Accountability Act puts in place this emissions reduction plan. So for the first time, we have the government being accountable for putting all of its intentions and all of its policies on paper and publish it so we can all take a look at it. And at the Climate Institute, we've been independently assessing this thing. We're going to do it again. There's another one being released this December. And basically, the governance frame allows everyone to get a better handle on what's going on. And then secondly, the government has to implement a little faster and a little harder, and they've been quite slow to do it. Big regulatory agenda, bureaucracies are stretched, and regional interests pushing hard against progress. And of course, politics. So the politics on carbon policy is really hard. So in conclusion, it's a mixed bag. I'm very optimistic given how far we've come in eight short years, but it is a half full, half empty sort of situation where there's a lot more to do, and you could get sort of down on progress quite easily. I prefer to be a bit of an optimist and look at all the movement we've made, and yeah, think about where next we have to go. So I'll stop there and say thank you, and yeah, over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Dave. I'll pass it directly to Dan.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Kat and Dave. And following up the two of you, you've provided an excellent overview of both Canada's status, all the knobs and dials that we have to work with, the challenges ahead of us. And I'd absolutely sort of echo the big, question on implementation. And to Kat's point, are we going to stay in that 2.5, 3 degree window? I usually put if in capitalization for a reason, because as Dave and Kat both alluded to, it comes down to implementation, not just in the Canadian context, but elsewhere. I was tasked with giving a little bit of a sectoral lens, so I'll pick up on Dave's point on that. And luckily for me, earlier this week, there was a major global perspective, but it echoes some of the things Dave said on Canadian sectors, but at a global global perspective. So the headline, I just want to get their title right. The world is woefully off track on climate goals was their bottom line. It was a consortium funded, I think, by Jeff Bezos' Earth Fund. They looked at power, buildings, transport, industry, food and ag, finance, and I think a couple other ones. And they came to two key messages. So they had 42 indicators of success. So where there was 2030 interim targets for something, 41 of those 42 were off track. The one that was on track, I think Dave mentioned to it, was share of electric vehicle sales. So that's the one place, at least in a global context, where there was some optimism. Their second key message, though, to Dave's point on glass half full, half empty, was even they, as experts, as optimists, we're seeing pockets of spectacular gains, I think is the wording they use. So this is why, I'm in the same boat as Dave, that one day you're radically optimistic that we're headed in the right direction, and you see that sustainability transition taking off in certain pockets, and then you see other reports that come along and you feel very pessimistic. So it absolutely is a mixed bag at the global perspective. So when we talk about Canada, sometimes we can certainly get down on ourselves in terms of our performance. And as Sarah said, we're last in the G7, I think you said, Sarah. Climate Action Tracker has us rated. So this is how the international community sees us a little bit too, highly insufficient on policy action, our fair share of NDCs and finance. So that's partly how the international community sees us as well. As Sarah mentioned, I'm co-leading a global tourism sector stocktake, and our findings are very similar to that other global sector stocktake, in that any interim targets we've got for tourism, aviation, and cruise are subsectors. All the emissions were all growing pre-pandemic. The pandemic put a big pause into that, but now we're recovering basically to pre-pandemic sort of record levels. So there is no bending of the curve in any of those that would suggest that we would be on track to hit 2030 targets in any of those areas either. And it's one of the sectors, Dave, is in his modeling, we've talked about this before, how do you deal with tourism? It often falls through the cracks, at least at the international level. Whose emissions are those? The same with cruise, it falls in there. So that's part of the reason why we took on that challenge. In a Canadian context, I just will quickly say I was at Destination Canada's conference last week in Ottawa, and speaking to some of the topics that we'll speak to today. While in fairness, they're recovering from COVID, when I showed them how tourism policy in this country is absolutely misaligned with our climate policy and gave them some examples of what that looked like, there was a lot of glazed looks. Their minister has climate action in her mandate letter, and I don't think Tourism or Destination Canada really, is making any efforts that I could see visibly that's consistent with our Paris Climate Agreement. So there are areas that we're making good progress, but I think at the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a few sectors that that have a lot of work to do to get aligned. I'll leave it there, Sarah.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate all three of you, taking a step back and setting the stage for us a little, and also tempering this sort of pessimism, I guess, about Canada's climate progress. Certainly, it's a complex picture, and policies that we design and even those that we implement, there's a time lag between the implementation of those policies and delivering the results that we need. So that's really important to keep in mind. I'd like to move into a discussion with all of you, and hopefully I will be able to see all of you on the screen at once. That would be great. And actually, if you don't mind, because you're all professionals at this, I want to throw a little bit of a question back at Kat and Dave first, just based on your initial interventions there, because I'm sort of curious. Both of you, I think at least implicit or explicit in what you were saying, attributed some of the success we have seen over the last several years to the Paris Agreement. That we had these much higher estimations of where we were headed in terms of warming, and in the years following Paris, those have shrunk. And Dave, you mentioned that we had this patchwork of provincial policies, and that has kind of gelled into something more coherent. I wonder if either of you can help me understand how we attribute that progress to the Paris Agreement particularly. And maybe just like, this is a broader question about there's always those who would challenge the global scale as the correct one in which to, the most effective one at which to go about this, and other alternatives are proposed. So how do we think about that, the direct role of Paris in our progress so far? Anyone want to take a swing?
Sure, I can break the ice on that. I think it is in our nature, a human nature, to constantly be seeking the silver bullet. So asking what is the most effective place to take action on climate change. And the reality is that action on climate change needs to be happening, everywhere, all at once, including at all levels of government decision-making. And government decision-making happens in the international multilateral space. So for me, the question is, what is the signal that the international space is sending back into countries to inform the domestic policymaking in country? And, in a big way, the Paris Agreement is responsible for having sent that signal into all countries of the world that thou shalt have a climate plan. I think it's fair to argue that we might be in a position, under a different kind of government, perhaps, and we certainly have been in the past, where Canada doesn't have a climate plan. We are now fortunate to have a law in Canada that requires the government to set targets and make plans to meet them. And so that does hopefully take us out of the situation that Dave described that we were in the past, of a very ad hoc approach to climate change at the federal level in Canada. But I think that's really the biggest thing that the international space does, that the Paris Agreement does, is it sends that policymaking trigger back into countries, and also sends a trigger into investment markets, which Dave might pick up on.
Thanks, Kat.
I'm an economist, but I'd rather talk about rock stars for this question. So we'd been talking about climate policy and the need for action for a long time, but somehow the French got everybody excited about it, and it made it kind of fun. And that sort of, I think, picked up on a trend towards, hey, we need to do something. So that was one. So it was this sort of fun, interesting space to play in. And I think a lot of subnationals and national governments want to get involved. And the other big shift was the word decarbonization. So we had been talking about decarbonization for only about a year or so before the Paris Agreement, and that gave something other than targets to think about. It gave it a long-term aspiration, and it gave it almost a roadmap. So the targets become one discussion about relative effort and who does what, which gets into a fight right away. Decarbonization talks about broad-based reductions across the board and shared effort. So I thought that reframing was quite interesting. So you throw a bunch of, frankly, white wine and good food in the mix and some rock stars, and then you have a neat concept. And yeah, that's where we are.
Okay. Yeah. So interesting in terms of kind of a global peer pressure and context setting, right? And it's a storyline, right, about where we are headed collectively, which I always find fascinating, that the story that, for instance, the renewable energy transition is well underway. Just, you know, the more we say it, the more we sort of embody and then make decisions that align with that future. So that is kind of interesting. And actually, you know, I've seen in terms of the value of global processes, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is often criticized for being too slow or too constrained in its findings and not locally relevant enough. You know, it tends to be quite high level. And yet, you know, I've worked directly with municipalities and, you know, local nonprofits who hold it up as like, look at what the international community is saying. Now, how do we figure out, you know, what this means for us? So it's even though it doesn't do all of the things, it sets a storyline that's really crucial. Dan, I'd like to bring it back to you. You know, we've been talking about the challenge of having many of the tools at our fingertips now. Some of them, not all of them, but at least the tools that might get us the first, you know, to our first set of targets. And there being this implementation gap and this perhaps still an ambition gap, although we could discuss that at length, I think. So what kind of capacities do you think we need to move faster, to accelerate our progress on both the greenhouse gas reduction side, the deep decarbonization and emission side, as well as what we would call adaptation or protecting communities and ecosystems from the impacts?
I mean, a whole range of things, from finance, governance, innovation, that you can speak to far better than I can, and Dave and Kat as well, and finance, capacity building, other dimensions. I'll just throw out something to get us started on that discussion, and that's the position of universities. I'll put that hat on here, and as you know, my experience with Destination Canada last week showed me we still have a way to go in terms of climate literacy. These are people making decisions in sectors, and climate change necessarily isn't really on the radar yet. So there are some policy areas of Canada that have a long way to go. And so almost probably 20 years ago, when we first started teaching at the university level, we wanted climate literacy on all frontline professions. Mainstreaming, I think, was the word that we used for a long time. And Engineers Canada have done that. Professional accountants and other professions have done that. Landscape architects, but some of the other sectors, like I said, haven't been doing that. And then if we go back at our performance as universities, right now we only maybe 7-10% of our undergrads, if we're lucky, are going through, you know, a climate change 101, so are coming out climate literate. And UW has been a leader in the education space. So if we're doing that, and then our Master of Climate Change, we started 13 years ago, going through the process for that, even with a healthy cohort of 50, that's less than 1% of all University of Waterloo grad students. So again, in the leader. So, you know, are we, even as the academy, doing what we need to build that sort of first generation of professional climate change people that, you know, Dave and Kat represent that, but we're bringing people up into all of these professions, and I don't know that we're doing as much of a job that we need to. One of the things that we included in our stock take for the tourism sector was actually to look at that capacity building within the sector. And while we looked at industry, we looked at governments, one of the lenses we looked at was the Tourism Academy. You know, are we researching like our house is on fire, and are we teaching them to put the fire out? And the answer was no in both counts, as far as we could determine globally. So part of it, I think we also want to turn the mirror around at ourselves, and are we doing a good enough job to support all of the different players, municipal governments, industry, that are making some of these decisions with the kind of knowledge that they need, and the skills coming out in the next generation of people that are going to have to get us to those interim targets, and then long after I'm retired, get us to net zero, the bigger challenge.
Yeah, so that's such an interesting point, and as you refer to climate literacy, it always makes me think, like, what exactly do we want folks to be literate in, right? Are we trying to churn out atmospheric physicists, students who understand the justice implications of climate change, or how to govern it, or what the political dimensions are, or is it sort of all of the above, the fundamental science as well as the social science? So I wonder, maybe to put a bit of a different spin on that, Kat or Dave, what is your sort of understanding of the capacities that we need to build here in Canada to deal with that implementation gap, that sort of acceleration of progress? Either of you?
Kat, you want me to jump in? Skills gap. Oh, okay, so one of the things we really need to do, okay, so let me back up. Competitiveness. So we think of competitiveness in climate policy as pain and suffering for industry or affordability issues. And it sort of consumes all the oxygen in the room and in the press. And really what we need to do is think about, how do we compete like crazy on the world stage with low carbon technologies that we can then deploy domestically really cheap, and we can learn and we can innovate. So we need a bunch of policy and direction around innovation in the country, and really thinking about capitalizing on those opportunities. And so that says we need a bunch of techie folks, and drive forward with that. And I can't stress that enough, just moving away from this, the poor large industry or this or that, or a little bit of cost. I mean, there's this massive opportunity out there we need to capitalize on. Then our policy people are quite smart, but they're quite bogged down. We need more skill, riffing off Dan's point, we just need more skilled policy folks, like the folks listening in the room. If you're interested in climate policy, jump into government, jump into the private sector, civil society, and help out, because this problem is not going away, right? It's net zero. We're going to zero, folks. Destination zero, right, Kat? So we need smart brains, and it takes a long time to learn this stuff. Last thing I'll say, anytime someone says, "Oh, I have the solution to climate policy," I run away screaming, or or here's a technology, this is going to solve it. I'm like, you're a technology junkie. This problem is almost intractable. So we need all hands on deck and a lot of smart minds, and you can always learn stuff in this field. So yeah, so we need a lot of brains on tech side, a lot of brains in policy, and I'll stop there.
So maybe building on that point, I'll direct a question to you, Kat. So Dave, you're saying that that there's this enormous opportunity for Canada to benefit if we rapidly innovate in the decarbonization space, or in renewable energy, et cetera. Why does it matter what Canada does, Kat? Why is leadership so important here?
Great questions. Maybe I'll give what I would have answered in response to the previous question for a minute, to steal a moment of time, because I really agree with Dave and Dan's points. And then also want to point out that we need a lot of folks to do the nitty-gritty transition work on the ground. I mean, millions of homes to retrofit, so much work to be done at the ground level as we move toward more climate safe communities. And we need our policy making to be thinking out of the box of incremental emissions reductions, that's where it really got stuck for a while in the climate file. And we're now in a place of working toward transformational outcomes at the systems level, and thinking at that systems level and outside of the box of incremental emissions reductions is so important. And a big piece of that is figuring out how to include social benefit in our policy making. So how we make sure that the positive benefits of climate action, and there are many: cleaner air, more comfortable homes, cheaper energy bills, are really front and center, in particular for most impacted communities. And I'll just plug a project that I've been working on called the Affordability Action Council that's trying to propose some recommendations for this kind of integrated policymaking that launched yesterday. Why does it matter what we do, whether we engage in this kind of integrated policymaking in Canada and meet our climate goals? I mean, there's the practical reasons. Canada is one of the world's 10 largest emitters. Our emissions matter. This myth that you might have heard that Canada's emissions are inconsequential is a straight up lie. To think that one of the 10 largest emitters in the world, our emissions reductions doesn't matter is the kind of hubris that I really can't bug with. When it comes to our per capita emissions, Canadians emit more than pretty much anyone anywhere else in the world. And so it's clear at a very practical level that Canada has some significant contributions to make to the global effort to meet the climate crisis. We also have historical responsibility. Canada's been in that top 10 net emitter, for the last couple of centuries, and we haven't ever left that space. And we have the capacity to do it. We're a wealthy country with the ability to transition and the ability to model policies to the rest of the world. And then I'll just add one more reason that I think Canadian leadership does matter. Canada plays a really interesting role in some of these international spaces. Heading to Paris 3 weeks into the mandate for the Trudeau government, who declared in their election campaign that they cared about climate change. It was amazing. It was moving to see how excited other countries were to have Canada back at the table. We can punch above our weight in the international space. And that international leadership, even though it is sometimes out of step with what we're actually doing here at home, we're facing our implementation challenges as we've all laid out. But it does, I think, help bring some capital into the space and some bridge building that Canada does in that world.
Thanks, Kat. That's really helpful. And it's important to think about, I think, Canada's responsibility on the global stage through a multitude of lenses, right? Through the historical emissions, our responsibility for those emissions, our high per capita emissions, our potential to lead, and the wealth and resources that we bring to the equation. It's very hard to argue that less wealthy, less industrialized countries should step up if we're unable to ourselves as well. So I really appreciate that framing. Thanks. By way of a segue into a conversation a little bit about the adaptation side of the equation as well, to focus on the toll that climate change impacts, especially certainly unbridled climate change take on communities here in Canada and around the world. Dave, can I ask you to help us understand, to sort of pit against this idea, this sort of common story we hear that the costs of decarbonizing are so enormous and it's a tough pill to swallow, especially given the affordability crisis and inflation and such. So the cost of decarbonization, can you contextualize that with a bit of an understanding about the costs of doing nothing, or what we're trying to grapple with here, the scale of the challenge?
Yeah, we've all been, and writ large, the royal we, like governments globally have been focused on mitigation, on reducing emissions. We have to do something, and adaptation was always the poor relative. Didn't get a lot of attention, didn't get a lot of time. But as soon as you go into the mitigation space, you're talking adverse competitiveness outcomes, imposing cost and affordability issues, which again sucks the oxygen out of the room and frankly makes the whole discussion very neurotic. Competitiveness neuroses is a thing, right? And so adaptation was really not being paid attention to. And then you had the science saying, well, it's going to be an issue, but it's going to be sort of mid-century issue. Well, not that science was wrong. We just couldn't see, how aggressive the climate reacted. And so fast forward to basically the last few years, we've started to do a lot of analytics around what do you get for what do you spend, trying to basically turn the science, which we've all known about, into something that can balance out the costs associated with mitigation with the cost of inaction. What do we get from reducing emissions? And then what are the benefits of adaptation? So we did at the Climate Institute a report called, well, 4 reports called, costs of climate change. And the last one we did was a chapeau piece called Damage Control. And I encourage you to go read it. We did a whole series of bottom-up studies that linked sort of geographic impacts of precipitation and temperature from global climate change scenarios down to kilometer level impacts in Canada, overlaid populations, infrastructure, agriculture, forestry, some tourism, Daniel, not enough. And what we found is that, surprise, surprise, the economy is being dragged down now at quite a rapid pace because of all these events, storms, heat impacts on labor productivity, health costs, infrastructure being destroyed and having to be replaced. So there's a big drag in the economy. We figure that right now the economy is about $25 billion slower. This is from our modeling. Modeling is very uncertain. $25 billion smaller, cumulative impact, about equal to half a year of economic growth right now. It's not to say the economy is growing at half the pace, but cumulatively over the last 10 or so years, dragged the economy down. Out to mid-century, massive impacts, and across the board. So all that to say, we're seeing significant impacts now, bit of a surprise, and it shows up in the economic data and it shows up in the modeling. And it's a bit of a wake-up call. And then we finally, last thought, we looked at the benefits of adaptation. So adaptation pays in a big way. Paybacks of about 15 to 1. So for every dollar you spend, you can avoid costs, upwards of $15. And so really the recommendation is governments need to spend way more money in adaptation, continue to reduce emissions, and focus on, as Kat says, making our communities climate safe. So I'll stop.
Thanks very much. Dan, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just want to echo Dave's point. I think I saw probably about 2 years ago a sea change in many people's, to your point earlier, Sarah, that climate change was this risk decades down the track, to a heat dome in southern BC of 40 degrees, a heat dome in London, England, 40 degrees, things that caught even climate scientists sort of, whoa, didn't see that coming, at least not for several decades. It caught our attention. I think it got the public's attention. And then you throw fires, you throw combinations of fires and storms on the East Coast. And most of Canada's attention has been attuned to what does this mean now? We don't have to imagine it decades in the future. So I think it changed the course of the dialogue, certainly at a local scale. And I've seen that change in the types of questions being asked of me. And I just give you one example. So in Colorado, a couple of the communities have sued Exxon and Suncor, because you have to sue who works in your state. So they've done that. So climate litigation, climate science, attribution science are improving to the point where when one of these lawsuits sticks, then it's not just about adaptation. There's cost recovery in the short term. There's loss and damages in an international context, in a bigger picture. And I think there, at least in the international scale, I think Canada has a role to play, both for its own emissions, but I think as a country that has the potential for migration to support countries, we have to take on, that's a place of leadership I think Canada can play. I think in some of the other areas where maybe, as Kat said, we can punch above our weight to some extent, but that is one of the places where I think we could really play a role going forward. We are one of the few countries with fairly open borders, and recognize while Canada can have some upsides and downsides on climate change, there's places in the world not that distant from here, the Caribbean, where there really is absolutely no upside. And we have to be willing to support some of those countries, and migration, for better or worse, is one of those mechanisms where we can play some leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, this brings me back to the conversation we just had about climate literacy. I will forever be mystified that it takes climate impacts or extreme events happening to me and people I personally know to elevate our perception of that risk, So it seems like empathy might be joking aside, a key element of climate literacy going forward. I want to bring adaptation and mitigation together. So what I want to avoid is a conversation where we say, you know, adaptation has been ignored and all funding and oxygen has gone to mitigation. So now is the time for less funding and oxygen to go to mitigation and for us all to focus our attention on adaptation. And for the last couple of years, I was supporting the federal government on the development of Canada's first national adaptation strategy. And I was part of these types of conversations where expert, extremely well-intentioned adaptation practitioners and representatives from various sectors are saying we need to hold on to this attention that adaptation is finally getting. So let's not, you know, dilute our conversation by bringing the two together. But I wonder what opportunities we miss, I guess, when we don't think about about adapting to climate change in a low carbon way, and when we fail to think about you know, advancing our renewable energy system and decarbonization practices without thinking about what's happening in extreme events and the vulnerability of critical infrastructure. So it seems to me that there are abundant opportunities. Not everything is win-win all around, but there are opportunities to do both at the same time, and we tend to neglect those. So I wonder, this is an open question for any of the three of you that feels comfortable speaking to this. Are you seeing evidence that we are making progress in dissolving this artificial, in my view, boundary between the two? And if not, why not?
Are we making progress in seeing the boundary dissolve? I mean, I'm not sure that we're quite there yet. I think perhaps the boundary is dissolving in the lived experience of people who are, you know, in the midst of a rapidly changing climate. I think that is definitely true. But from a policy-making perspective, these two things are still quite siloed. And I'll point out that at the international scale, there are negotiations underway for a global goal on adaptation that would be, you know, similar in scale to the global goal and holding warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5. And so there is this kind of attempt even globally to bring more attention to the adaptation issue. But I guess what we're seeing on the ground that I think we could start to see better reflected in policymaking, and this gets back to the point that I was making earlier about more integrated policymaking that does more than one thing at the same time, is that we certainly can design policies so that they have multiple outcomes. So, you know, if we can think of an example, restoring wetlands is a really crucial way to shore up you know, to create kind of boundaries for water catchment around areas that are susceptible to erosion. Also, a really important way to be rebuilding carbon sinks in the natural environment, rather than turning our eyes toward magical technologies that we hope come along sometime in the future, like actually restoring our natural carbon sequestration potential. A critical way to help restore ecosystems that are necessary to help with the loss in biodiversity. And being an East Coaster myself, I've participated in waterland restoration activities that bring together communities and give a concrete, palpable way to participate in the climate challenge so that people are really understanding themselves and the benefit of taking action on the ground on climate change. If we can have policies that drive those sorts of solutions that can achieve multiple outcomes at once, and importantly, figure out how to communicate about those to people on the ground, I do think that that can help us accelerate and kind of cross these bridges, these gaps to implementation that we've all been pointing out, and these artificial boundaries between the kinds of action we need to be taking.
Thanks for that, Kat. I appreciate that. Daniel, you unmuted. Would you like to?
Sure. I would just echo everything Kat has said. I think certainly at the local scale, decision makers, and even at the business scale, some of the people interact, they want to know about both, but they tend to still put them in two buckets, and they don't look for the connections between. I think there's a little bit more understanding of oh, Canada has massive wildfires. That's part of our carbon budget. They're starting to connect some of those dots that maybe they weren't before. But in the defense of most decision makers, it is complex. Like for any one community to do a comprehensive assessment of its carbon and climate risk and how all those pieces fit together and then connect with all the other things Dave tries to model, that's tough to do for any consultant to get their head around, to even help them. So we face that challenge with our sector decision makers of trying to understand that complexity and where the policy entry points are that might get you some of those co-benefits that Kat talked about. They often don't see those entry points. And unless you've got what I would call a translator, somebody that knows the policy of that sector and how it connects to other sectors well enough to support that, I don't think it's moved as far, certainly, as we would have wanted it to in the last 5 years. But I agree with Kat. It's moving in the right direction, but slowly.
Yeah, there's room there. I agree. And I mean, from the examples that both of you offered, and in my head, I always think also about like rebuilding homes after a flood. To what standard do we rebuild those homes, and are they connected to natural gas for heat? And like, are we locking ourselves in after rebuilding, post extreme events, to high carbon pathways, or are we taking this terrible opportunity to to make some progress on other things? And I do think there are communities, cities, nations around the world who have done a little bit better at this than us, and so perhaps that could reduce some of the complexity if we were learning those lessons. Dave, do you want to jump in here, or are you okay?
Just a quick observation. I mean, one of our challenges is governance arrangements. Municipalities are creatures of the provinces. Municipalities roll out the infrastructure. They're at the pointy end of the stick on adaptation. It's all about sort of modal shift and green cities and reducing emission footprints, and where most of us live, work, and play. And so that's a bit of a challenge, and the federal government playing in that space is hard. So we have a governance challenge in the country, but it is the municipalities where this all really happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. And so there's a capacity building issue there, right? And there's a jurisdictional challenge, like what they actually have control over and what resources they bring to bear on those questions, but also the capacity and the technical skills and partnerships that are needed to deliver on this. Yes, and I have to say, to play devil's advocate to my own question, I have heard in the Canadian climate discourse real skepticism about bringing these two together as well, because with the argument that we need to keep our eye on the prize, and that prize is rapidly decarbonizing as fast as possible, and the more we make this a complex, multi-layered issue, the more drag there is on our progress. So there is that perspective as well. But I appreciate that here in this room, we're talking about all of the things, many of the things that matter to us, and decarbonization is one of those things. But as you mentioned, Kat, biodiversity and protecting communities as well as decarbonizing and many other things are crucial to sustainability if we take that deeper lens. I do want to put out to our audience, and there are many of you, anytime you'd like to pop a question into the Q&A panel there at the bottom of your webinar screen. I'm very happy to pose your question to our panelists. I have an infinite number of my own, so I can continue with our discussion, but I'll look out for questions in the Q&A box there. We don't have a ton of time left to us today, everyone. So I'd like to pose a question to all three of you in whatever order you see fit, to sort of return to this question of the global stocktake and COP28 coming up. So we've gone down to these challenges at the local level, and in the middle there, we talked about Canada's responsibility and the governance challenge federally. So let's zoom back out a little bit as we approach COP28 in Dubai, and we hear more and more about the outcomes of this global stocktake. What are the burning issues for you at COP28? What are you listening for? What are you hoping for? What are you quite nervous about? So what's on your radar when it comes to COP28? Whoever would like to start first.
I'll throw one quick one. So the whole point of the stock take is that the evidence for ratcheting up would be there, whether it's the peer pressure, whatever would make that happen. I'm curious to see how that plays out. This is the first time we've been through this stock take process. We've seen, the stock take report come out. We've seen country pieces come out. We've seen some sector, and day by day, we'll get more stuff tossed at us as we come up. But how will that affect the negotiations? That's the interesting sort of, $1 trillion question to me. Is peer pressure going to be enough? Is there going to have to be some kind of carrots that climate leaders are going to say, if you're going to trade with us, we're going to have some mechanism to make sure we're all on the same page on the climate file? Is it going to come to that? And that's what I'll be looking for. What comes out at the end of the day? How did the stock take process contribute to ratcheting up, if it did at all?
Thanks, Dan. Kat?
So what the Global Stocktake presents us with is an opportunity for the Paris Agreement process, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process, to really shift into implementation mode. And I would argue that, in the last few years, we've been seeing parties show up to these COPs, so countries show up to these COPs demanding progress on loss and damage. And last year at COP27, we landed a loss and damage fund after 30 years of fights to have the irreversible losses and damages that countries are experiencing as a result of the climate crisis acknowledged, and for there to be financial support for them to address those losses and damages. And we've also been seeing parties loudly call for that space to help them with the energy transition, because it's a complicated transition that at this point needs to happen very quickly. And it's a transition that no one country can do alone. It requires international cooperation to make it go faster and to happen cheaper. And so will the Global Stocktake be giving, and by the way, the GST, the Global Stocktake, is the thing that's supposed to tell countries what they include in their next round of NDCs. So it's like the blueprint for countries for what they should be doing to enhance their climate ambition and their new Paris goals. So will the Global Stocktake provide countries with this signal that we were talking about earlier, that it's time to improve their energy transition plans back at home, and to include those energy transition plans in their Paris Agreement pledges? And I am working really hard on that, and in particular working hard to see finally for this process to acknowledge the need for us to phase out our dependence, so the production and use of fossil fuels. It's taken 30 years for us to get to a place where there's finally a conversation happening about the cause of climate change in the climate negotiations. And many parties are looking for that outcome as well. And it would be a real game changer. So I'm hoping that we get the right signals to countries to improve their climate pledges by including sectoral plans and energy transition plans in their NDC, and that we get that indication, that global agreement to phase out fossil fuels while we phase up renewables and energy efficiency.
That's really helpful, Kat. Thank you for that. Dave?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to pick up on implementation. We're in the implementation era. Targets are interesting. I call it targetitis. We have a target disease. We're just focused on targets. We're now about doing it on implementation. So we're in an implementation phase. As part of the Global Stocktake, or a parallel piece of that is something called the Biennial Transparency Report, the BTR1, which is going to require government to basically lay on the table what they're doing in terms of implementation, and then to also do performance reporting, so evaluating their own policy and saying where they're going, which then signals to the global community and signals domestically where we're on track or not. And that then feeds in Canada's case into the Net Zero Accountability Act and the ERP, the Emission Reduction Plan, forcing the government to get much more focused on assessing policy. And then a really important concept called course correct. So course correction is all about finding gaps in your policy where we can add new policy and go deeper. It's about turning the knobs and dials on existing policy, so basically increasing ambition. But it's also perhaps fixing policy interactions that are working against each other. And there's a whole series of policies that are squeezing the same carbon margin, and they're interacting. One works, the other one doesn't, the other one just imposes cost. So we have to clean this stuff up. So that's what I'm really looking for, is basically the federal. So what happens in these international negotiations is it pushes down into Canada all this stuff that the federal government has to do, including for inactive, climate inactive government, like the Harper government years ago. It forced them to do a bunch of stuff they really didn't want to do. And it'll be the same with every successive federal government. So that's what I like about the Global Stocktake, pushing some of this important stuff down to Canada level that allows all of us to understand where we're headed and where policy needs to be fixed up, adjusted, tinkered with, that sort of thing. So.
Thanks, Dave. Well, despite the fact that we've been obsessed with targets, I guess that's a step on from being obsessed with baselines, which I think is what preceded the target. We've moved on from there. And you opened a topic for future conversation that I really wish we could dig into now, which is, of course, this is a tricky time politically in Canada, and there may well be a shift in priorities and party federally. So considering the implications of that for our progress, accelerated progress on climate change is an important topic, and perhaps one for another day. So I have a couple of thoughts. I won't belabor them, but just to wrap up this really helpful conversation. We, in the context of the upcoming Conference of the Parties in Dubai and this global stocktake process, we have really, really important information about what we've done so far, what we need to do differently. And while progress is being made and tools and technologies and policies and laws are available and have now been tested for many, many years, which is not something we could have said 15 years ago, the three of you have really helpfully framed this for me as moving, the architecture in some cases is in place. And we're moving into this need for rapid implementation. And as you highlighted there at the end, Dave, as well, creating those iterative opportunities for really closely reflecting on whether this is working, course correcting, making sure that we're evaluating our policies and our actions according to the right metrics, and doing our very best to deliver on multiple objectives simultaneously, so that we deal with a host of concerns that Canadians and folks around the world are facing. So I appreciate your help in kind of teasing apart where there are real opportunities for Canada to lead, to be a part of accelerating the decarbonization process, and this transformation that is already well underway, and also take very seriously the impacts that we're seeing, especially on the most vulnerable right now. So this isn't, a future problem to be put off by 10 or 50 years. This is an urgent challenge as we speak, of course. So those are just a couple of the takeaways, I guess, and I'll be watching closely at COP28 to see what comes out of this process of ratcheting up ambition, dealing with the issue of finance, of scaling up the flows of finance to support deep decarbonization and adaptation and loss and damage, all critical issues for the global community to address as we move forward. So if I could see you all back on the screen again, I will just extend my sincere thanks for your time and for your wisdom, and perhaps most importantly for the effort that I know all of you put in, day out, to support Canada's progress and global progress on climate change. It's really remarkable and admirable. So thank you to Dave Sawyer, to Cat Abreu, and to Dan Scott for joining us here at the virtual Waterloo Climate Institute for this session. And please, those of you who have attended, feel free to reach out to us at the Waterloo Climate Institute. Keep your eye on our events page for future panels. We will be doing a series of check-ins live from COP28 in Dubai, so that you can hear what's happening there, and if what our experts are looking out for is actually unfolding there. So with that, thank you all sincerely. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks.
Have a good day.